it'll trickle in for a bit. Also, while Walter's resoning, and soon to resonate, I want to let you know that there have been some people who have disappeared from our midst. Melinda Clatterbuck and Chad Nicholson are gone. Pamela had a graduation of her. She teaches at Harcum College, and she had graduation today. Sarah Willie LeBreton is both a Swarthmore professor and on the Board of Governors of Haverford College, and they had graduation today. So various of these people have said, please give my best wishes and regards to all of the people, but it's a busy weekend for a lot of people, and there have been graduations and weddings and pre-existing conditions and so forth. So, Walter?
Okay.
Go ahead.
So, I brought my violin because I have trouble leaving it behind.
Okay.
I just like to play it when I'm away. But I also was thinking yesterday morning when Amanda Kemp was talking to us. And she was talking about body prayer, and when we called banter, what did we say? It felt like a body prayer. And when we did that, I felt like I'd like to share what sort of my body prayer is. And I feel that way when I play the violin all the time. Not all the time, but I try to go for that. And I'd like to play for you a tune called Chopin Farewell. Many of you may know it. And just to give you a little background, it was written by a fiddle player named Jay Unger, and he and his wife Molly Mason run a camp, like a music and dance camp in the summer in a Chopin. I forget what state it's in. Maybe New York. New York. I've been here. Yeah. So one year, it was. Most people think this is a Civil War tune because it was picked up by Ken Burns and was used in the Civil War series. That's where most people identify with it. And it sounds like a Civil War tune, but it was written in the 1980s by Jay Unger, and he wrote it as a farewell to the end of the season in a Chopin, because he loved the place, and it was just a little nostalgic. He wrote a Chopin farewell. Just one little kind of activist note that's an aside to that is that after it became world famous because of the Civil War series, which was the most watched thing on television up to that time, the Army wanted to buy the rights to the tune, and he said no, he didn't want to associate it with the war. So, a Chopin farewell.
people who are really still here? Who is?
She is really good. I know why she left. She's having, yeah, with her son, because she left at, I'm just gonna let it go.
I think we're going to let it go. People know what time we're starting. So, friends, I think Jonathan has already been introduced. I don't think I need to go further with that, although I guess for our live streaming audience, I probably should do that. We're very pleased to have with us this evening Jonathan Matthew Smucker. He is the founder and director of Beyond the Choir. That's at beyondthechoir.org. It's a Lancaster organization, and they do a good bit of consulting with community groups and movements and campaigns in order to clarify messages, front-facing outward messages, helping with organizational development in organizing bodies and action groups. And Jonathan has been an organizer and strategist and message maker in a number of campaigns, including Occupy Wall Street. And he has written a new book, which just came out this past January, called Hegemony How-To, Roadmap for Radicals. And it has gotten extraordinarily high praise from Jeremy Scahill, Francis Fox Piven, Bill Fletcher, Astra Taylor, everybody who is anybody in the world of movement politics. And he is also getting his PhD in sociology at Berkeley at the moment, so he's a busy man. We're very glad to have him with us this evening, and tell us a little bit about your topic. Again, was I've now completely had it fly out of my head.
Me too, it was fine.
It has to do with winning, I know that. We had a duty to win earlier on, but it's how do we take our movement politics sufficiently seriously so we actually campaign in order to win is at least part of that, of the message for this evening. And before I bungle anything further, I'm going to let you take over.
Sounds great. Oh, I've got it. I've got the title. Do I need to use a microphone?
Would you please use
Sure thing.
this microphone?
Sure thing.
Or if you want a handheld.
Nope, this
you
is,
can
I'd
use
rather
this
have this one. Yep. Great. Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody at Pendle Hill. Yes, it's the talk is called Political Threat and Organizing Opportunity. So, you know, do you mind if we start out singing a song together? Great. I just feel, you know, it's been like there's been a lot of talking today. There's going to be more. And I actually haven't done this as one of my talks yet, but I do like to sing. And there's a union song that I really like that maybe some folks know here. I'll do call and response. It gets a little bit tricky at one moment to do call and response because the cadence changes, and then we'll do it all together. So we're going to take a couple minutes for this. So I don't even know what it's called. I call it Step by Step.
Yes.
Right. So step by step, the longest march can be won, can be won. Step by step, the longest march can be won, can be won. Many stones to form an arch, singly none, singly none. Many stones to form an arch, singly none, singly none. And by union what we will, and by union what we will, can be accomplished still, can be accomplished still. Drops of water turn a mill, singly none, singly none. Drops of water turn a mill, singly none, singly none. And do it all together. I'll say the lines before. Step by step, the longest march. Step by step, the longest march can be won. Can be won. Many stones to form an arch, singly none, and by union what we will can be accomplished still. Drops of water turn a mill, singly none, singly none. All right. And yeah, I've been thinking about that song a lot lately because it is a moment, if there ever was one, in my lifetime where we need collective action. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ideas in my book in relationship to this political moment that we're in, where there's so much threat and so much opportunity. And so the book has a weird title, Hegemony How To. There's been a lot of debate about whether it should be called that, but it is what it is. And it's a little bit of a provocation, right? Because hegemony is something that we think about as what our opponents have. And I'll get into a little bit about what I mean when I say hegemony how to. And to think about that in some respects, we want to be hegemonic. I'll get back to that. So that's a provocative assertion. And it's getting at some of the ambivalence about political power that we in progressive social justice circles understandably have. But really the first half of the book, at least, is really kind of hegemony how not to. And it's about some of the pathologies, might be, it's a strong word, but pathologies, paralysis that sometimes our social movements are plagued with. So growing up, I hardly knew what a social movement was. I mean, I'd heard of the civil rights movement. I knew some things, but I was pretty sheltered. I grew up rural, working class, very religious. Life revolved around church. And by a series of accidents, I kind of dove into social justice work back in high school. The first thing I got involved with was the case of Mumia Abu-Jamal, the first protest I went to in Philadelphia in the 90s. And I dove in real strong then. In high school, you can read about it in the book, but first chapter's a little autobiographical, but I started stirring things up in Lancaster County. But then quickly, because I really didn't have mentors, I was kind of like this political orphan, I moved into the Catholic Worker in Washington, D.C., and I dove kind of headlong into, kind of had like this serial relationship with like different pockets of lefty subculture in the United States. And it was amazing. It was beautiful. I found my community. I wrote in my journal. I found my church. I was very religious. But I recognized that this love of a beloved community and this bonding with each other and this coming together to affirm and to have rituals like what we just did together with that song, just how beautiful that was. And I really lost myself to the movement. I went through a number of years where it was just, I felt so free. I was poor. I was working odd jobs to be able to do activism and organizing full time. And I was living on hardly anything. was in my 20s, but I felt so rich in this experience of being able to give freely to this group and trust that this group had my back. And so this bonding, this sense of community was so important. But some things bothered me. A couple years after leaving home, I read in my journal that my plan was just to leave for a couple months and to come back and organize where I was from. And I forgot all about that. I forgot that that was my intention. And I, was kind of a chameleon back then, and I just kind of took on the subcultural stuff. Like when I moved into the Catholic Worker and they were into civil disobedience, I got arrested every month for like a year, 2 years. When I became an anarchist, I wore all black and I went to punk shows and I loved it, right? But I was a bit of a chameleon. I was taking on these things. I didn't know why. It wasn't like a rational, calculated decision. It was like, these are my friends, and I started to become like them. And but something about it, even though I found so much meaning in it, something about it bothered me. And it would become kind of poignant for me in some moments. So I ended up part of an occupation of land in Minnesota to stop a highway. It was an occupation with Earth First and the American Indian movement and a neighborhood coalition. And it was really beautiful. And it was really intense, actually. That's where I met Ricardo. There were things about it, though. We would have these like community days where a lot of people would come, and my closest friends would kind of cluster off and just talk to themselves. I could see the circle closing, like literally closing. It's a day of outreach where we wanted to talk to like other people in the broader community, and there was this cliquishness happening, and it wasn't intentional, right? But and it would happen in these other ways of like kind of dissing people just really pretty close to our worldview, but like just a little bit away, like they're too liberal or they're this kind of group or that kind of group. And I didn't really have a vocabulary for thinking about these dynamics, but over time, one day I had this epiphany. I was like, oh, we're doing ritual together. It's like church. It's literally like we're bonding together. We're creating culture together, and that's important, but it's different than building a political vehicle that has aims to accomplish X in the world, right? Because ostensibly, in my mind, I dove into social movements because I started reading about suffering in the world and had encountered homelessness when I went to Philly and New York, and these things made really strong impressions on me, and I thought it was unjust, and I wanted to change injustices, and intuitively thought we have to come together because we can't do things on our own. It's kind of common. It's like very simple political. It's the logic of politics. You can't do it on your own. You come together with other people in order to have the strength to accomplish something. And I was like, oh, there's that level where we want to think about strategy and tactics and how to do it. And then there's this other thing happening that's social and that's cultural and that's psychological and that's bonding. And they get totally mixed together. They're inextricable, but they're conceptually two different things. And I had this epiphany about it. It was like, because I was part of this community that was doing the same protest every year, didn't really have a strategy about it. I was like, oh, this is just a collective ritual. This is for us, right? This is not really to change this thing. Nobody here really believes we're going to change this thing. I'm not going to pick on specific struggles here, but probably most people can think of something they've been involved with in the left that has this kind of like, and it's better than doing nothing, As far as coping mechanisms go, I'd rather get together with other people and affirm values because maybe an opportunity will come in the future to do something strategic about it. But it bothered me, and And I just had a lot of questions. And my friend Madeline and I, who was at this campaign, we started looking at these questions together of kind of this tendency toward insularity, and started wondering, what's that about? Why does that happen? And is it worse now than it was before? That was a big question we had. And I think it is. And I talk about that in the book. I've done a lot of research it requires a theoretical explanation that I'm not going to go into, but you can read the book. It is worse now, although maybe that's turning around. So since then, I didn't have a vocabulary for it then. I kind of did this swing at one point where I swung pretty hard on the pendulum, where I was really had thrown myself into the subculture, and suddenly I had this swing of disillusionment of, this is just for us. This is bullshit, right? This isn't like the FCC. I can say bullshit. Okay. Okay. Nice. And I kind of, in some ways, felt pretty harsh toward my own role in this, and sometimes it wasn't about strategy, it was about signaling that you get it, and signaling to the center of a small subculture in order to fit in. And I was pretty negative toward it, and eventually I kind of swung about halfway back. And I think that was really important, because I started to recognize that it wasn't just self-indulgent. The reason we're doing this bonding with each other is because there's a deep, deep need for community. And as I educated myself about the economic system and where we're at and the development of capitalism and society, and borrowed from people like Jürgen Habermas, who talks about how the logics of capitalism and bureaucracy and modernity have decimated community spaces, right? Have decimated organic community ties that we have with each other, right? Humans evolved, I don't want to glorify primitive humanity, but we've evolved in settings that are absolutely dependent on reciprocal generosity systems, right? And, like David Sloan Wilson, this evolutionist, talks about how basically we have like a plan A and a plan B, because we've evolved in groups where the logic of evolution is strong bonding in groups. And the worst thing is to be kicked out of the group and ostracized. We live in fear of that, right? And we live with rewards around belonging and affirmation. It kind of links back to some of what you were saying in your talk about how we need that affirmation from each other. And we're primally attuned to it. And so we have this plan A. I'll get into the theory for just a minute here. We have this plan A that we're happiest in when we give freely to the group, where we kind of trust fall into the group. We don't keep a ledger of who owes who what. We give our time, our energy, and when we can trust that the group has our back and our interests. That's how we are happiest as human beings. But we also have a plan B, which is when all the signals are there that the group doesn't have our back, that maybe there is no group. And that plan B is an individual survival plan. And economists and political scientists take the plan B and they think that's normal behavior. They call it rational actor paradigm, right? Or rational, whatever it is. And they don't understand the logic of collective action because they're such individualists, right? They've taken the neoliberal economic model, and it's also just the model of male bread earners, right? And only some of them. And they've taken that specific role where people are structurally positioned to defend, to be a dog-eat-dog world, right? Individual survival. And they projected that as the norm of humanity, human behavior. And it's not true. And so, early capitalism devastated some of those reciprocal generosity systems. We rebuild these systems wherever we can. And advanced capitalism and the whole wave of individualism over the past 50 years has done this whole advanced round of disrupting our community structures, making everything in the logic of individual expression, consumerism, profit logic. And so Habermas talks about that we are desperate for community, for bonding with each other, for this system. Because the plan B where it's individual survival, it's also linked with fight or flight, right? It's linked with stress mode, right? And so we're always in that mode when we're not trusting the group. So we're desperate to reconstruct this. Anyway, that was a long theoretical explanation for this basic idea that it's not bad that when we come into social movement spaces that we are looking to bond with each other, that we're looking to create community together. That's beautiful, and it's even necessary because people aren't willing to do the things that social movements require without that feeling of belonging and identity. They're not willing to risk jail time, to give hours of their time after a workday to take risks and to put in labor when there's not much of an individual reward, right? That bonding, that sense of belonging, that sense of a we is the lifeblood of political action. And however, there's a balance here, right? And I call this the political identity paradox, where the paradox is that we need that strong bonding in order to even have a movement, to have a political group. It's necessary. But the stronger that bonding is, the more that coherence exists, the more likely we are to construct walls between ourselves and the broader social forces that we need to align with in order to win change, right? So, subculture and even, things like punk rock, right? Patches and piercings and, it's very, what's the word I'm looking for? When something's very noticeable. Well, things like that, right? So, conspicuous, right? Like punk rock is easy to pick on because it's especially conspicuous, right? But we actually do this in all kinds of groups in society, right? A rugby team or a quilting circle or a group that sports, is that a Pendle Hill hat? Yeah, right? Yeah, so we start to take on, we start to look like each other. We start to have signals that signal our commitment to the values of the group. We start to develop our own specialized vocabulary. And some of it's technical because we're looking at a specific set of problems. So, just like a group of carpenters has some technical language, a group of activists might too, right? But some of it is about signaling belonging. The problem that we have with this in progressive social movements compared to any other group, there's two problems. The one is that in an oppositional struggle, that sense of bonding and differentiation can be injected with a shot of steroids really quickly. It can spiral very fast because you're in an oppositional mindset. You've got enemies, and when you're being attacked, right, it bonds the group. You've got to have each other's back, but groups can kind of go off the deep end and start to enclose themselves from the allies that they need to align with. That's the one thing. And the other thing is just the difference in if you are part of a rugby team and you bond over playing really hard and you bond over what jerks your opponents and the team are, right? You're going to play all the harder. Great, you accomplish your goal. If you like to play the video game World of Warcraft with your buddies, great. You develop an identity around that. You get to do more of what you like to do. No problem there. But our task is to challenge entrenched power structures. And we can't do it with the core of people that bond with each other. That core of people has to be the catalyst, right, for aligning, activating, facilitating the involvement of much broader swaths of society. And so we have to have an orientation to also bridge beyond the confines of any one particular subcultural identity. So that's some of what I talk about in the book. This tendency toward insularity and how to navigate it. And I actually think that leaders have to play a particular role in navigating that. And to do that, you've got to acknowledge that you have leaders, and leaders have to take extra responsibility. Now, there's all kinds of ways of defining leadership in the way that we want to. Leadership doesn't have to mean some of the negative things that it means in the society. It doesn't have to be, in charge, but it's people who have extra authority because, and I mean authority as in earned authority, because they're giving a lot of time and that they've developed some sort of expertise on the issues, right, have to take responsibility for setting the group culture and making sure that the group doesn't go off the rails in insularity. And I'll just give you a very, basic idea of, one of the negative examples of this is like Students for Democratic Society imploding and some of them going off the rails and becoming the Weather Underground. Now, there's all sorts of historical factors. I don't want to oversimplify it, right? But part of what's going on is that signaling belonging to the group is an escalating thing. Groups tend to escalate. Like the most hardcore thing tends to win out in oppositional struggle. And so once hardcore became defined as taking up arms against the United States government, that it's hard to argue with that. It's hard to argue with something once it becomes defined as like this is the essence of the group, because to argue with it is to announce that maybe you don't belong in the group, right? And so that's a case of a group kind of spinning out of control. A positive example at one part in its history of navigating this paradox is a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, where the tendency toward hardcore was still there, right? Like people want to be hardcore, they want to up the ante, and there's good things about that. Campaigns actually need to escalate, right? But good leaders defined that hardcore thing as going into areas that are dangerous in the country, going door to door, talking to people, registering voters, being bad at it at first. I mean, we often think, I think retroactively about the civil rights movement, it's like it's blacks organizing blacks in the South. It was mostly middle class, educated blacks in the North, crossing a huge class divide, failing at first, not knowing how to talk to people. And hardcore was sticking with it and learning how to do it, right? And it was hardcore, right? But here's the way that good leaders flipped that script of, instead of hardcore becoming this kind of spiral that got the group more and more out of touch, it made the hardcore activity something that put leaders in constant contact with a broader base of people in the context of a campaign that had external goals, right? And so without those external goals and without structured activities that force you into contact with a broader base, that's how movements kind of spiral. So I talk about this in the book, and related to it, I talk about our ambivalence about power, which is well earned, right? Power has done awful things. There's very good reason to be ambivalent, deeply ambivalent about political power. However, I argue, and part of the reason I use this word hegemony provocatively and talk openly about power, I think that sometimes we crop power out of the story of social justice because, for a couple of reasons, and I am gonna go for a minute into the theoretical one of why it's worse right now, why insularity is worse, because it relates to this ambivalence about power. Part of the reason this tendency toward insularity has gotten worse over the past decades is oddly because of some of the success of earlier social movements. We earned, like the New Deal arrangement, we won the social safety net. We won this historic compromise between capital and labor, right? That was some version of social democracy. And the middle class expanded greatly. And so in 1968, in every industrialized country around the world, you have this explosion of a different kind of politics that the world had never seen. So it's not just class-based. Grievances start to expand. We're talking about gender. We're talking about sexuality. We're talking about race. We're talking about different forms of identity. It's really good, right? But the tone of politics starts to expand too. It starts to become more self-expressive. So these are good things in lots of ways. Here's the negative. The negative is, with the expansion of the middle class, you basically, this is Ron Englehart's theory, that he takes Maslow's hierarchy of need, where when you're struggling for material survival, right? That's all that matters. Like first air, then water, then food, then shelter. And then once you can take all that for granted, you've got this expanse. You can think about social networks, identity, self-expression. And that's good. That's like what we want for society. The problem is, with that material backdrop taken for granted, winning becomes less consequential in certain ways. And so you had this self-expressive politics where it becomes more about the group and about bonding, and the stakes of political struggle become less severe. Not to everyone. This is very uneven, just to be clear, depending on your struggle, right? But as a trend, the expansion of a middle class and the expansion of politics that happened with that over the past 40 years, then there's the professionalization among more liberal professional groups, right? Staff heavy. And then there's this ideological clustering and kind of refraction of like more radical groups. And if it's about self-expression more than it is about winning, if that's what's motivating you, and about bonding more than changing I'm not saying people don't want to change things. I'm saying it's less, it has been less do or die for a lot of groups. When it becomes like that, the tendency toward purism is compelling, because why would you want to talk about strategy? Strategy is like, it's corrosive logic. Politics is corrosive logic, right? Right? Like when I say that we need to think about power in politics and even being hegemonic, right? I'm not saying that that's problem free. I'm not saying that that doesn't come with incredible moral dilemmas, right? We know the history of liberation movements becoming oppressors, right? That's heavy, and that's what we have to be thinking about, right? But if winning's not important, if self-expression is more important than winning, then why would you even want those corrosive logics to get anywhere close to you, right? Because it's better to just take a righteous stand outside of the logic of politics entirely, aside from it, and to denounce the whole thing. And so these things go hand in hand, this ambivalence about power, which, to be clear, there's lots of good reasons to be ambivalent about power, right? But it kind of going toward purism and this tendency toward insularity. I'm going to land it with where we're at right now, and then I'm going to open it up to questions. So if you've got a little bit of a topic change, so if you've got questions from the last thing, just write them down or hold them. So I'm weirdly hopeful right now in this moment. I'm also terrified in this moment. I think the stakes are really, really high. And I talked about this in my earlier talk right now. I think the biggest threat, and it's real, is that authoritarian movements, proto-fascist movements, could consolidate power in a number of states, including possibly the United States. I think the 1930s is, in many ways, the best corollary. It's not perfect, right, to look at, but the crisis of legitimacy that I talked about earlier today, where the political class, political authority has lost legitimacy with a critical mass of the populace. When that happens, both poles are emboldened, and both poles start to contest the premises for political alignment and for having a society. And so that crisis of legitimacy, I think, started somewhere in the Bush years, comes to a head with the financial crisis. And it's the first moment that the political class understands that there's a crisis of legitimacy. But as soon as stability is achieved, with the whole financial markets not totally unraveling, they think that it's over, that we're in the clear, right? And this is classic of a crisis of legitimacy. The political class never sees it coming because structurally, materially, dispositionally, they are out of touch with the pain of everyday working people. And you have it in both political parties. You hear the Democrats talking about the strong recovery. Well, it is an uneven recovery, right? And so the crisis of legitimacy hasn't gone away. And you see it on the right with the Tea Party movement, on the left with Occupy Wall Street and the social movement renaissance after that, with Black Lives Matter, Standing Rock, these different movements, you have this new vibrant contest where people are actually getting more involved in the civic process and politics again. More people, we're expanding. But the contest and the stakes are very, very high. So in the 1930s, you know, like there was a strong fascist movement here and there was almost a coup here. In Germany, in Spain, in Italy, the socialists almost won. Highly contingent outcomes. The stakes are very high. So this is the downer moment of the talk, right? The stakes are very high, and we need to hold that. We need to understand. And the biggest danger in the United States is that Trump could consolidate a right-wing populism, and it could become popular. He appears to be unraveling now, but that could turn around. A terrorist attack, a war, even an infrastructure bill that has enough popularity that he consolidates that alignment. Usually when there's a contest like this, one side wins and consolidates a new hegemonic bloc. And when I say hegemonic bloc, I mean like the New Deal coalition had like a 40-year span. The Reagan coalition basically had a 40-year span, and we're at the end of it. It's like falling apart, right? And Trump is trying to reconsolidate that. It'll be new and different if he does it. It's not inevitable. In fact, there's a lot of things against him. The demographic shifts on the issues, their issues are unpopular. Our positions are popular. So there's a tremendous opportunity here as well for us. And so I always hesitate to talk about the opportunity without first talking about the stakes, because the stakes are very high right now. My mother-in-law is always saying, tell me it's going to be okay. I'm like, I don't know. I don't know if it's going to be okay. It's up to us, right? It's up to us. It's not a moment for complacency. The opportunity, though, is unlike anything I've seen in my life. I couldn't leave the house for 3 weeks after the election in Lancaster. Not a single time I left the house. Not a single day went by where I wasn't stopped on the street by somebody, most of whom have never been involved in anything before, and saying, what can I do? Tell me what to do. I need to do something. I had one person say, I will work 20 hours a week instead of 40 hours a week and live on half as much if you can give me something meaningful to do, right? People want something to do. There's a tremendous opportunity. The number of people who want to get involved. The hard thing is, we're not acculturated to facilitating that volunteer energy. Our organizations are staff heavy. We're used to running campaigns that we're in control of and that rely on small numbers and that really brand everything with this particular organization or that particular organization. The shift we have to make right now is the shift of helping to unleash and lightly facilitate, but in some ways facilitate, an unwieldy force that we can help pull in a direction, that we can help give some guidance to, but we are not in control of, right? That's the moment. It's everyday people getting back involved in the process of democracy. It's the democratic revival that we so desperately need and have needed for decades, but that's messy, right? And we're uncomfortable, and people from middle class or higher backgrounds, which tend to be a lot of the leaders in social movements today, or in movement organizations, at least the ones that we have, are uncomfortable. There is a profound class insularity in the United States today. And so the tendency to talk to ourselves, I talked about the social psychological dynamics with that, but there's a profound class aspect of it today, where we are more comfortable talking. Middle class people are more comfortable talking to middle class people, upper class people talking to upper class people, and people are not comfortable having the problematic conversations with working class people and poor people who don't have the vocabulary that we have. And it's a huge challenge right now. It's one of the cruel ironies of this moment that the most enlightened political discourses are inextricably linked to an elitist academic discourse that's inaccessible to people. And so, when Trump attacks PC culture, you bet he's going after the gains of social movements. You bet he is going after the civil rights movement and feminism and gay rights. He is absolutely attacking those things. But the complicated thing that I think we're often not seeing is that part of why it's resonating isn't just prejudice. That's there. but it's also that he's tapping into resentment of an elite that has left so many people behind. And it's the genius of the right-wing populism that it foments prejudice while also appealing to often legitimate resentment, right? And it mixes those things together into a deadly cocktail. But we have the opportunity to have a different kind of populism in this moment. A progressive populism that doesn't make a choice, that doesn't say we can only talk about class. We shouldn't be talking about race or gender or climate, right? We cannot have a progressive populism in the United States today that says, oh, let's only talk about class. We cannot do that, right? But we also have to talk about class. And we have to pick fights with Wall Street, with the financial system that's emerged, that's consolidated power. We have to do both of these things at once. And I'm not saying it's easy, but I think we can do it. And I think there's evidence that we are doing it on certain levels. I want to say a word about that. So one of the opportunities we have with Trump as the villain. So again, hearkening back to like the narrative conversation earlier today, right? It's good for us to have really clear analysis about race, class, gender, all these pieces and how they interact amongst the core. But we also have to recognize that this unfolds in this messy pedagogical process that is bringing society and different pockets of people along at different paces, right? And so an opportunity we have, Trump represents symbolically some of the worst parts of American history, kind of like a throwback, right? Misogyny, racism, xenophobia, and the worst of capitalism, all rolled into one villain, right? And so you have a moment, a week into the administration, where suddenly the plight of immigrants, refugees, and particularly Muslim ones, one of the most, vulnerable constituencies in the United States, their struggle becomes the symbol of the whole united opposition. Those are the types of moments. Now, that's not, not everybody who's showing up has this full intersectional analysis, right? But it's a moment where people are intuitively expanding who they identify with, who they are in solidarity with. And those are the types of moments that we have opportunities for in the coming years. So I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing in Lancaster to ground the rest of my part, and then I'm going to open it up to questions and conversation. I think we'll take 3 at a time like we did before. I like that. And I also wanted to say last time, and I forgot, feel free to respond to each other too, right? It doesn't all have to be questions for me. In Lancaster, Lancaster's hardly a bastion of progressivism, right? The city is changing. There are progressives in the city, but I think we hit this moment very well, and we've built a 2,000-member organization since the election. We've turned out hundreds of people consistently at Representative Smucker's office. Yes, he is my second cousin once removed. At our and he blocked me on Twitter. And our state representatives' offices at the town square. We've been turning people out in the hundreds, one day in the thousands, 2,000 people, probably 3 times as many people, 2.5 times as many people as what anybody remembers in the past 50 years at least for any kind of public demonstration. That was in protesting the Muslim ban. And we're plugging people into working groups. We're getting people involved. And I want to say a little bit about our theory of change for how we're doing it as like a very grounded way of addressing this like bigger theoretical question and the opportunity that we have right now. We thought that protest, direct involvement in protest and direct involvement in electoral work is something not many people who we wanted to bring into our base had direct experience with in Lancaster City and County, and that those were unfamiliar, and that there's these long-term cultural scripts that scare people away from that space, from stepping into it. And we wanted to build an opposition movement after the election that has protest, that turns people out into the public square. And we wanted to build an opposition movement that has an electoral strategy too. We actually think an electoral strategy is quite important right now. And we also want to like blur the lines between those things while being legally compliant. Because that full separation of outsider movements being kept so far outside and inside game being totally disconnected from movements, we think that's disadvantageous. But both of those things, electoral and protest, we thought were unfamiliar spaces to a lot of people. So we thought we need to create a civic face to this, a face that feels accessible to people, that feels like something that they're just intuitively part of. So we started with an emergency community meeting. We don't use words, we've identified a lot of words that we hardly ever use. We don't use words like activism and activist. We talk about the community. We say, let's get together and talk with each other. We use pretty plain spoken language. We don't try to download our whole analysis on our flyers and in our Facebook events. Our first one, we talked about a lot of us are upset. We need a space to come together and process what just happened and to figure out how to move forward together, what to do, right? So we foreshadowed that we're going to be getting to action, right? But I actually had like a couple fights about this with national people. There's an email list I'm on where I talked about what we're doing, and a pretty prominent social movement theorist and organizer who I really respect was like, that's the dumbest thing ever. You've got to have a strong ask that you catapult people into right away or you're losing them. What are you doing? We were right. And it's worked. Yeah, it's worked. And part of it is that you come with all the answers right away and you've broken the pedagogical process that people are in. You're suddenly the expert. And people are like, well, who the heck are you? Right? And why am I, people are still dealing with their emotions. And so we created a space, small group discussions for people to reflect together, to mourn together, to be together. But we still told the story. It took about 3 meetings before we started really getting into the action. And by then, our base was like, what can we do? What are we going to do? Right? There's ownership. People are asking for it. People are helping to figure out what it is. Right? But creating that space, and we told a story the whole way through. I want to say a couple things about this story, and then I want to open it up. We told a story about what a disaster this is. We name Trump as a huge threat, but we don't leave it at that level, right? We say, to understand, we need to not just be mobilizing against Trump. We need to understand how Trump happened. And immediately then we say, and we got some negative feedback on this at first, but we stuck with it and we've won people over. Not everybody, not the full Democratic Party. But we say, part of what we have to understand is, how did Trump win? The Democratic Party has failed to inspire people because they failed to fight for working people who's supposed to be their base for decades now. They failed to do that, and we're going to make them fight for working people. We're absolutely going to pick an open fight with the current leadership of the Democratic Party, and we're not going to make any apologies for that. And part of why we're going to do that, and this seems like a complicated story, but this is what's really struck me in the past few months. People, stuff like this that seems inside baseball, everyday people are actually really hungry for inside baseball conversations. They want to understand how politics works and how they can make a difference. They want not just a story about the issues, but a story, a believable path to how we might turn it around. And they want to understand how that would work. And so we've gotten further into the weeds than what my training would have me believe is advisable. And we've been leaning into it. Now, you've got to set up your terms. You've got to walk people through it. But the next step that we say is the other part of why this has happened is that everyday people have been part of why the Democratic Party has been able to not fight for a working base or working class people, right, is that they haven't been pushed to do so as strongly as they've been pushed in the past. And why haven't they been pushed to do so? Well, we haven't been involved. We've been less involved as a society. Civic participation has declined. The union movement in particular, it had its own problems like the bureaucratization, but it was also brutally attacked. And the shifts in the economy, all of this is combined to weaken this. It's always been an imperfect vessel, but it has profoundly been a vehicle that everyday people can have some voice in a broader political system that otherwise wouldn't listen to them. And same with our community organizations and civic organizations generally. And they've all declined, right? And in that void, the finance economy has come in and rigged the political system, and lobbyists are literally writing our laws in every session, right? And so, long story short, how we are going to turn this around is everyday people are going to get back involved in this process. And that's what this is. That's what Lancaster Stands Up is, right? And the last thing we say, which I think is quite important, we say, some of us up at the front of the room here, we do this full time. We're organizers. Movements need a handful of them. Movements need many, many more times people who can give 2 hours a week or maybe 4 hours a week. Maybe you're retired. Maybe you can give 10 hours a week. But this is the moment where we all need to be figuring out how 5 years from now, 10 years from now, you're going to be still involved. And not just involved showing up to protest, involved in a way that adds some capacity to a collective vehicle that we're building together. And if that's coming in 2 hours a week to do data entry or to make phone calls, that's 2 hours more capacity that this vehicle has. And so think about how you're going to do that. And it's been working. People want to get involved and they conceptualize themselves as part of it. I think about 2/3 of our base has not been involved in stuff before. Or maybe showed up to a protest one time or did something, but very, very light involvement, and people are getting involved. And so we started canvassing finally, going door to door, registering voters and signing people up for Lancaster Stands Up. And we've tested the same script in working class neighborhoods going door to door. We were worried it would be too complicated, both to talk with people at their door about the needle that we thread and to set up volunteers to do it. So it's weird. We are actively trying to register people as Democrats so that they can vote in the Democratic primary because we want to contest primaries, right? So it's counterintuitive to come to people and say, we think the Democratic Party sucks and you should register to become a Democrat, right? Because that's, in some ways, that's the story. There's a couple more steps in it, and it actually works really well. In fact, declaring how much we don't like either party is what opens the door. Not every time. I mean, there's variation, right? But more times than not, in the working class neighborhoods, we're knocking every door in. When people think we're going to go for a specific party or candidate, they're real hesitant. And when we're like, we don't like either party. We think Trump's a particular disaster, and we've got to defeat him, right? But I'm not happy about the political establishment. What do you think about the political establishment? What issues are important to you? We ask a bunch of questions, right? Not a bunch, a few. Get people talking. And then we pitch them if they're sympathetic, right? We say, we want to build an independent political vehicle called Lancaster Stands Up. That's everyday people. We're the folks who turned out 2,000 people to protest Trump's unconstitutional Muslim ban. People are like, oh, really? Oh, that's great, So people are excited about the story of independent political power and the story of because these people are not listening to us, right? And they're not going to. We have to make them listen. And so we're experimenting with this. It's not I don't want to give the impression that we have all our shit together. It's a messy experiment. But I think it points toward a couple of the opportunities that we have right now, profoundly, bringing it back to the earlier part of our insularity. We have the opportunity to break out of that insularity in such a big way right now. We have the opportunity for everyday people who are just clamoring to get involved in things to open the floodgates But we have to change, we have to reorient, right, how we do things. And I think, the narrative of picking an open fight with the current leadership of the Democratic Party, but not running third party, because we think that's, you can disagree with us, but we think that's a doom strategy in the United States because of the winner-take-all system. The story of building independent political power that challenges people, that uses the only tool we have to make these people listen, which is the primary. That story has been winning over people who don't want to do anything with elections and who like either voted Green Party or Bernie or bust, or just like don't think we should do anything elections, won a lot of those folks over. And it's also won over at the other end, a lot of people who think we shouldn't be criticizing the Democratic Party at all right now because Trump is such a threat, we should just focus on him. And the argument that's won a lot of those folks over is that Trump has this faux populist mantle. He's still presenting himself as an outsider, and, his target of the media is about continuing this, like, I'm the populist, hitting the elite institutions and their assumptions. And it is working with his base still. And that base could become bigger at any point, depending on different events. The only way historically to get the populist mantle from somebody, populism works in a crisis of legitimacy. Like, it's the currency, it's political currency in a crisis of legitimacy. And I don't want to rehash the 2016 election, but the worst thing you can do in a crisis of legitimacy when you're against a right-wing populist is to run the candidate who symbolizes the establishment to people, right? And that's in my estimation rhetorically what happened, right? We have to reclaim that populist mantle, and the way to do it is to pick fights with enemies that actually are more compelling villains, right? It's a more compelling villain to talk about the greedy corporations. It's just there's not a political opposition party in this country that's not timid about doing that, right? And sorry, I can be long-winded. I want to say one more thing and then open it up, but. And this is why, this is the profound dilemma of the Democratic Party for the past 40 years. And just to be, I think I've made clear, but sometimes I get responses in this where people think I'm arguing that the Democratic Party is good. I'm not. I'm arguing that we should think about it more as a terrain, that we can build power and contest within that terrain, than to think about it as an impenetrable monolith, because of the particular constraints of our two-party winner-take-all system. But the dilemma of the Democratic Party is that, so George Lakoff, not George Lakey, George Lakoff, don't think of an elephant, smart guy. Drew Weston, also smart guy, cognitive neuroscientist. They've both got really good frameworks, but one of their assumptions, and I think maybe they don't really believe this, maybe they do, but it's for like marketing. They're like, one of their premises is that like Republicans are good at messaging and Democrats just aren't, right? Right. And so they attribute it to like, Democrats are like Enlightenment thinking, rational argumentation, and Republicans are much more fluent with narrative. I don't buy it. There might be a hint of truth in that, but the profound dilemma, the reason the Democrats are bad at messaging is because their historic base and the base that they could have a supermajority governing coalition that would be unstoppable is working class people. And their functional base is Wall Street and big money. There is no narrative that inspires both those groups. It's impossible, right? You can't be timid about naming Wall Street as an enemy in a moment like this. You can't do that and think that you're going to inspire working people, right? And so that's their dilemma, and they've got to pick a side. And right now, let me be compassionate for them for a minute. It is actually a strategic dilemma. If money is what determines elections, right? They're going to kiss that money goodbye?
And it didn't.
Exactly. It didn't, right? And so that's what we have to show. We have to show that taking bold stances and picking fights like can actually win elections. And I'm not saying we should pour all of our energy into elections and abandon social movements. In Lancaster, we're trying to do both of those things at once. which is a fun thing to do. It's really fun. It's really new for me. But anyway, that's in a nutshell, not in a nutshell, in a long-winded way, some of what I think the openings, the opportunities are that we have right now. I think the tendency toward insularity that I talked about is probably going to go away in, not entirely, but the floodgates are open. I mean, in the years ahead, there are, like, if winning wasn't important because people were comfortable before, that's all going away. Like millennials, like the stakes are really, really, people understand that there's so much at stake. And so I think we're going to have an increase, a huge increase in political involvement, but we've got to make sure that it's pouring in the right direction. So thanks. All right.
Thank you. Yes,
So,
indeed.
I had 1, 2, 3, and then we'll do you next. Go ahead. You wanted? Yeah,
I just want to encourage. There are some folks in the room who have really not said very much at all, and I'm just looking at you at the moment and wanting to make sure that if you have a question, you will get recognized. Okay? So think of what you want to say, because I know you're in the work and doing it. So I want to make sure you get heard. So, Terry.
I guess avoiding the third party direction is one thing, but have you considered ranked choice voting?
Great.
Ranked choice
Yep.
voting.
Great. And we'll do 3 in a row.
I'm curious, you've done a lot of work in terms of onboarding new folks into the political moment and civic engagement and social movements and electoral work. And I just sort of love to hear your thoughts about where you've gotten pushback from folks who have been organizers, and when you think fighting to get them on your side is worth it and when it's not. Just speaking from a place of someone who I haven't yet figured out how to manage my energy in those conversations, and feel like I can spend a lot of energy talking to other organizers and trying to convince them that there's a political opportunity we need to step into with more boldness. So if you have any advice on that.
And who's the third one?
Right here.
Thank you for your thoughts on helping us see through expanding democracy. Should we be concerned about the continuing move towards privatization?
Great.
That's 3.
Yep. So, ranked choice voting. I would name among other, so like ranked choice meaning like if we had ranked choice voting, Al Gore would have been the president in 2000 because people voted for the Green Party, would have put Al Gore second, right? And the Green Party not winning would have, their votes would have then gone to Al Gore, right? And so it makes it so that actually if you had ranked choice voting, right, you could have a third party in the United States that wouldn't be throwing away your vote or enabling the Republicans to win, right? And vice versa. The Republican, like the Libertarian Party, could emerge and it wouldn't be throwing away their vote for the Democrats, right? You could have different parties because people could, we could have a left party in the United States, maybe the Working Families Party or something else would become like a bigger party that we could, all progressives could vote for that candidate first and not be fearing that they're throwing away the election, right? So that would be great, right? There's lots of solutions. Just to break it down for a second, when I say we have a winner-take-all system, right, like most countries have a parliamentary system, which is proportional voting. And the consequences of us not having one are profound on a lot of levels. And a lot of people don't think about this, that, you know, in a non-proportional system like we have, a winner-take-all system, it always contracts to two parties. A couple times in our history, one of the parties has been knocked out and replaced by another one, and it right away contracts to two. And the reason it contracts to two is because you have one winner for each office, and so you have just over 50% wins, and so it's counterintuitive to try to, it's not counterintuitive, it's like self-sabotaging, right? And in a parliamentary system, you could have a left party that gains 7% of the vote and gets 7% of parliamentary seats. And the long-term consequences of this are that we don't have a left political party, and that's actually devastating in so many ways, because in a parliamentary system, if there's a left party that has 3% of the vote, 5% of the vote, 7% of the vote, they're never majoritarian, but there are key moments where they have veto power or where they're needed, where they can negotiate. And political parties actually train a lot of people in political skills. So in other countries, you have left political parties, not saying they're perfect, but they train a lot of young idealistic people to do politics, to understand political contests and struggles. Whereas in the United States, young radicals learn how to have politics, how to have a political analysis, meaning understanding the issues, but not really ever learning the skill set of collective wills in conflict with each other in the negotiation process, the part of like political struggle and democracy. And so over the long term, that's devastating, right? And so I'm all for changing that system. I'd like us to have a parliamentary democracy or ranked choice voting, and different cities have experimented. You've got this in Minneapolis, right? You've got ranked choice voting, right? So all those efforts are very important. They're hard to win because they're process arguments, right? And so in the long term, I'd love to transform our system. In the short term, I think we have a model of how to at least exercise political power in relationship to the constraining system. And we've seen that model in very recent years. It's called the Tea Party. And I'm not saying we mimic the Tea Party in every way, but the idea of building an independent political vehicle that pushes one of the major parties and exercises power and primaries people, right? I mean, they've taken control of the Republican Party, and they've steered it, right? And a lot of Democrats are like, well, we don't want that. We don't want to be that. And, you know, they've wrecked the Republican Party. Well, they stopped most of the Obama agenda. They've won lots of things. They won this election. They've won both houses. And the crazy thing is, they've done that with really unpopular positions on almost all of the issues, from taxation to healthcare to, these are not popular positions. They're red meat to their base, right? And so when you have a Democratic leadership that says, well, we don't want that because that's extremism, the asymmetry here is that on drug legalization, on mass incarceration, on gay marriage, on reproductive rights, on progressive taxation, on healthcare for all, most progressive positions right now enjoy supermajority or supermajority support. So you have a Democratic Party that's afraid of going boldly for popular positions. It's dumbfounding. And I guess I'll say one more thing about it. Sorry, I'm but I think their political mistake is they think that we're orienting ourselves as a society on a liberal conservative spectrum. And they're partly right. We do that, right? Society has this liberal conservative spectrum, mostly on social issues, that we do orient ourselves on. What they don't understand, and this has to do with the crisis of legitimacy, is that there's this other spectrum of populism establishment. And that spectrum, Americans are more and more orienting ourselves intuitively on that spectrum. And it actually is, I would say, more motivating and more powerful right now than this. And that's why it confuses people who have a deep political analysis, how people could vote for Bernie in the primary and vote for Trump in the general. That happened with at least 10 people that I know. It's not, I don't think that alone would be enough to swing the election, but like that was actually a phenomenon, not just an anecdote. But it's because of this other spectrum. People are angry at the establishment, right? And so we absolutely, yeah, so anyway, in the meantime, I think we need to build independent, progressive power that contends within that terrain. But in the long term, I'm absolutely for those things. And then your piece on, can you say one more, the last part? Oh, yes. I like couldn't, yeah. I think that as soon as you're organizing a new base of people who hasn't been involved in politics and actually onboarding people in numbers, it becomes the only thing that matters, right? And so I've seen a lot of my friends who, like a lot of my younger friends who are in their 20s, like oriented unconsciously toward like kind of posting a thing and wanting their radical friends to like it on Facebook, and like being devastated and paralyzed when they don't. And we're orienting our messaging then toward the center of our insular circle. And so in Lancaster, like it's so refreshing. It's so refreshing giving less fucks. Sorry, pardon my language. But like as I get older, I'm like, oh, I just give less, I care about that conversation much less. Not that I don't care about it at all. I wrote this book. This book is much more for people who identify as radical. So I do put energy into that. But I think probably my days of that are a little bit numbered, because like I really think that once you're engaged in the process of onboarding a constituency that has not been enfranchised in the political establishment, feeling what it's like to develop collective action agency, that brings me so much joy, that process, that messy process, and it really is what matters to me. So I say I have the 80-20 rule. I had an epiphany like 10 years ago that I was spending 80% of my energy like doing damage control for people that I didn't think were strategic and that were often destructive, and 20% of my time doing stuff that I thought was strategic. And I was like, I've got to flip that equation, because you do have to do damage control sometimes. Like you've got to engage, and you want. And here's why I do put energy, and why I put energy into writing this book, is that some of the people who are making these mistakes are some of the most dedicated people, right? And like for myself, like actually getting some clarity around the mistakes I was making, it made all the difference in the world. And so like being patient toward each other, like it's good to bring other people along, but it's better to organize big bases. And then finally, your piece about, I read my notes, but then I forget the question.
How concerned should we be about?
Oh, privatization. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, the neoliberal logic of like free markets and all that, it's not popular anymore. It doesn't hold up, but it still owns the whole political establishment. So we should be very concerned. They're still doubling down on this recipe that is the source of the political crisis, right? Right? So we should be very concerned. I mean, we've got to, the decimation of the public is what we've witnessed over the past 40 years, right? And, I recommended in the earlier session this book, Dog Whistle Politics by Ian Haney Lopez. That's a key intervention in that book, is talking about how the decimation of the public was tied toward the strategic racism that was like, oh, these welfare queens are taking advantage of us, right? And that's how they weaken the public. They use racism strategically to do it, to make a privatization and free market agenda have popular either support or acquiescence, depending on how you look at it. And so I think we've got to fight on that. But part of how we have to fight on it, we also have to take on that strategic racism head on. Yeah. So 3 other questions. I'll try to be less long-winded next time. Yeah, sorry. So I've got 1, 2, 3. Great.
Can I do one?
Okay, one. We'll do 4 in a row. 1, 2, 3, 4.
I was very struck about your remarks about the Democratic Party. I've been active in Philadelphia with a group of young people who are recently woken up and organizing and working second jobs on top of their regular jobs. And it's been very inspiring. And I know that I need to spend, I'm amplifying their sound, their message down there. But I also know probably my time is better spent in my own community, in my own neighborhood. And I'm rather new to the area. And a call went out, please come down to the Democratic office and sign these petitions to get people on the primary. So I went there. I had a hard time finding the office, and I made a remark about it. Hi, I'm new. Sit down and sign these 40 petitions, which I did. And I was waiting for them to say, oh, would you like to sign up, volunteer? I left them. I said, well, where do you have a volunteer sign up? It was the same thing. And I left feeling these two women there were chatting between themselves. It was a social club, like you alluded to before. And I really realized yeah, I forgot about this part of politicking, and it's just soul deadening. Have I gotten an email from them? Have I gotten a phone call? Yes. And the couple times that I've shown up to do some tabling or visit my congressman, they got the time wrong, they got the date wrong, they didn't even make an appointment with the congressman. We just showed up and whoops, no appointment. So it's crushing. At the same time, I feel like I've got a lot of energy, but if I feel like I have to dismantle my local Democratic office, that's going to be a little rugged. So I just put there if anyone has suggestions.
What area are you in again?
I'm here.
Okay, great. I had, you can, but I had 1, 2, 3.
This is a follow-up on the privatization and also on something you mentioned very early on with Habermas's focus on civil society. And I can't remember because I put it in my phone and not on paper, the exact phrase of the non-monetary exchanges. What phrase did you use?
Reciprocal generosity.
Thank you. Reciprocal generosity. And it seems to me that one of the answers, and this is also responsive to the last question, one of the answers is go directly for creating civic institutions that are apolitical, that are cultural, that can do a lot of that work to satisfy people's longing for belonging without creating in-groups and out-groups. And you have to be careful about what you choose, but we've been really successful in Baltimore in creating a deeply interracial and intergenerational weekly event that goes from 7 o'clock until midnight every single Wednesday. It's a blues jam. And we were very intentional about including different constituencies and building the ones that were underrepresented over a 2-year period. But within 2 years, we managed to create this thing that is intensely meaningful to people. And the way we know that is that we lost our venue and had to move 100 people to a new venue on very short notice. And we managed to move all the musicians, all the veterans who had been at the earlier location, all the young dancers who follow us and swing dance every week, and in addition attracting a new cohort of older people. And people who come from elsewhere are astonished that this thing exists in Baltimore, since all they know about Baltimore is The Wire. And everybody's having fun together. And what it provides is that missing element of socializing with people that you don't know through other affiliations. And it serves that intense need. So particularly for people who are not comfortable with electoral politics or even with nominally leftist politics, that sort of apolitical politics where you're not debating issues, but you're seeing each other as human beings intensely and intimately on a regular basis. It's really powerful.
And we'll take two more right there.
I want to remind people that it was Bill Clinton that repealed the Glass-Steagall Act in 1999, and there was plenty of opportunity for Democrats over the last 20 years to support the working class when it comes to unions and union rules, and didn't even beat back all this, terribly aggressive action against unions. They just kind of sat by the wayside. And so many opportunities were lost, and also financial regulation, not just Glass-Steagall, but they didn't stop CEOs from stock buybacks and many other things that have increased wealth inequality. And I just think it's really ironic that the territory that was traditionally the home of the Democrats, going back to the New Deal, as we all know, has been co-opted by the people who made it, the neoliberals that actually made it worse for the working class.
Yep.
So how the frick did that happen? They made it worse, and then they convinced the people that they hurt that it was the other side's fault. So I'm still kind of trying to grok that one in some ways, but a lot of it has to do with the failure of the Democrats over a long period of time. I can't tell you how many times I wished that Hillary would have spoken up or been a different kind of person, were able to, respond in a different kind of way. She was supposed to be the one that was the most experienced, and the best candidate. Or how many times I wished that Bernie was up there debating Trump instead of Hillary, but that's past. The other thing that I would just like to say is that I really hope Trump doesn't start a war, because that's going to really consolidate his power if he's successful in doing it. I'm not necessarily asking a question, but I'm maybe more venting frustrations.
You want to hand the mic behind you?
Yeah, so I have, I think, neither a question nor a statement so much as some musings. Sort of riffing off
Awesome.
the lead musician we got up there, the soloist. Yeah. So, first of all, to me, it seems like we're in a time of churning waters, right? The wave has hit the shore, there's all this churning going on, and so I see most of the organizing that's emerging from that new organizing as being transitional. It's what will happen as the waves, it will produce, it's not a moment where there's going to be a consensus, a unity, or one model that clearly is the right model. I think we're going to see a lot of different models because we're dealing with a lot of different kinds of contradictions. And out of that, some of those will solidify and some will dissipate. I'm really pleased that some projects like yours is about base building and organizing, because we've leaned so far toward the performative and the provocative, which is a tension that almost tore SNCC apart at one time. And I do believe that movements should be all-terrain vehicles, that all arenas are locuses for struggle. In a session that you were in, Dad, I said that to me, the distinction is not whether you're working in the system or outside of the system, but are you within the delusion or outside of the delusion? And then I just want to push a little bit about the issue of the Democrats, because I don't think they failed, and they're partially clueless, but I think they're doing the best they can in a completely impossible dilemma, which is that the parties, in recent modern history, the role of the parties has been to offer the 1% alternative strategies, or be able to show that their alternative will deliver a support base to the 1%. And starting in the time of Bill Clinton, there has been no division in the 1%. The 1% has consolidated around a neoliberal consensus.
Yep.
And so that the Republicans their rhetoric is aligned with that consensus, and all the racist and misogynist crap they offer their base does not hurt the bottom line. The Democrats' promises, like you were saying, to the two constituencies are totally different, and their strategy has been to tell the 99% what they want to hear and give the 1% what they want to have.
Mm-hmm.
And they thought that would keep working.
Mm-hmm.
That's what Hillary's disaster.
Yep.
That was the strategy. Obama was much better at it.
Mm-hmm.
But what it means is that the idea of being held accountable, being forced by bases to actually, as people in this room are saying, represent working people, is an existential threat. They cannot do both, so that in the long term we're putting wedges into the cracks that will end up disintegrating it. So that when you're talking about sort of your project, I think that when we talk about the Tea Party, one of the things that gave them leverage was a credible threat that they would walk if they don't get their way.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there needs to be a nimbleness
Absolutely.
that the identity of the movement that's developed is that outside space, even if your analysis is at this time is that the strategy needs to be inside and third parties are not viable. I think the one thing that we really can count on in the coming period of years is surprise.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And there's a lot of ways we're going to have to redefine stances and just be very nimble and creative and remember, what's essential.
Great. There's a lot there. One, every time you talk, I just love the metaphors that come out of your mouth. It's just like, I really, really appreciate it. It's really great. I mean, I'm a big metaphor fan, but I usually have to spend a lot of time wrestling to find them, and they just flow out of you. It's amazing. I'm going to get to your stuff. I'm going to take them in order. So yeah, and actually your piece will connect with some of what Ricardo was saying here. But this repellent, this way that this cliquishness, this bonding, and this, people getting used to doing things in a way where newcomers feel unwelcome, right? It's a repellent, right?
Well, it's not just that, but I think in some sense we're threatening them.
Right, absolutely. And so actually I'm going to come back to that with Ricardo's answer, because I think that's absolutely right. It really connects with, it is an existential threat. I want to tell you about how that's playing out in Lancaster right now, because it's kind of fun times. Civic and cultural spaces. I mean, this is really important, right? Getting these cultural spaces. And I actually think connecting to what you were just saying, I encourage other organizers to find something in their life that fulfills that communitarian need, and not to put all of that onto their political involvement, because that's when people's political judgment becomes cloudy, right? Occupy Wall Street, the occupation of Zuccotti Park, right? To me, it was a beautiful thing. It wasn't just a tactic. It was this beautiful community, but it was also a tactic, and its political intervention was becoming the symbol of defiance at the doorstep of Wall Street, when nobody had held these people accountable for the financial crisis and for the rigged economy. But once it became that community and that fulfillment, then maintaining the occupation becomes the first prize in and of itself. And even when it had kind of lived past its tactical usefulness, right? And so we become attached to this thing, and I think it's much healthier for people to find other ways of fulfilling that in their lives, which isn't to say that you shouldn't find that in political struggle. People should too. The one thing I think that civic and cultural organizations, you said apolitical. I don't believe there is a such thing as apolitical. I get your point. I'm being a little pedantic with this, but that's one of the beautiful things too. I think there's this misconception that we have about activism and I talk about this in the first chapter of the book, that actually activism as a term is a word that wasn't used 60 years ago. It's been built, and I think it's not just a new word for old phenomenon. I think it actually represents one of the negative directions of individualistic neoliberal society manifesting in politics, where this thing called activism has become the space for self-selectors, right? That's how we've organized ourselves into self-selecting spaces that are class insular over the past 50 years in neoliberal society. And so the manifestation of that in political terrain is this thing called activism has emerged that is about, oh, I'm into activism, I step in here and I walk away from the communities I was organically part of. And my activism happens over here in this space with these special people. And either I don't talk about it over here, or maybe I wear my politics on my sleeve in a way where people think like, oh, like you're the activist, right? Exactly. As opposed to, you know, when movements blow up, when they really take off, it's not by winning over self-selectors who come as individuals. You get some of that, but it's by activating existing social infrastructure that becomes aligned with the movement's goals and then goes to bat for movement aims. That's how movements blow up, because suddenly you have all the infrastructure of existing institutions going to bat for political aims. So like civil rights movement, when black churches, NAACP chapters, and historically black colleges suddenly identify as part of a movement, suddenly you have all this infrastructure. And being a member of those institutions suddenly implies activity, and there's even social pressure to be active in these things. And so the line between those things, there's a value in these institutions in and of themselves, and they tend to resist politicization, right, because they have their own purposes. But there are moments when, you know, revolutionary moments or moments where lots at stake, where suddenly those existing institutions, and even after the Trump victory, a lot of professional institutions, I can't name which ones, have hired beyond the choir to give their membership something to do, right? Like institutions that are apolitical, right, suddenly are political, right? So I appreciate what you were saying. And then the neoliberal hold on the Democratic Party, and I want to say something, I'm going to get to the neoliberal hold on the Democratic Party, which ties together kind of three things. But the thing about war that you were saying, I think is quite important, and something we really have to figure out. I don't have answers to this. I have big questions. Even Bernie's campaign had 17 points on a platform, nothing about foreign policy. There's not a prioritization of this issue right now. And where there's not prioritization, it gives a blank check. And not only that, when Trump bombs Syria, suddenly everybody's like, and then what's he do? He drops the so-called mother of all bombs immediately after that. If you send a narcissist a signal that like you're going to praise them for dropping bombs, what do you think they're going to do the next 8 years, right? It's just, it's you know, not that there's any reason to not be disappointed with the punditry, but this is a really hard dilemma, is how to make a progressive movement internationalist again, and to prioritize foreign policy. And it's a structural dilemma, because we know that strong social movements, there's always a strong self-interest aspect in it, a felt self-interest, and the climate movement struggles with this in similar ways. It's not saying that there's not self-interest in it, it's just often hard to prioritize the climate or foreign policy because people have things in their lives that feel more pressing. And so even when you have a majority opinions, it's really hard to mobilize political power on these things. And part of this is absolutely by design, the way the military has been structured. And this is the class insularity, right? Working class people and poor people are serving in the military, and they are, as a class, disenfranchised from the political system and insulated from other classes. So we are not feeling what it is like, as a broader society, we are not feeling what it is like to be at war. We've isolated that.
That's all true and very powerful in and of itself, but I'm very worried right now because, like you said, Trump is kind of imploding, and I think as we get to the point where he's really imploding, his instinctive reaction is going to be to start a war.
Yeah.
And back into the,
Yeah, that's the authoritarian playbook.
yeah.
Yeah, it's a huge danger. It's a huge danger. It doesn't mean it will work. It's the authoritarian playbook, but it's also how authoritarians lose often, like wars gone bad. So it's very, but the stakes are very high with foreign policy. And even like, I mean, the idea of the nuclear, we know the stakes are really high, and I don't have an easy answer on that, except that it's a big thing that we need to be paying attention to. I really appreciated all the stuff about I absolutely agree about the Democratic Party. And it's an interesting question. Can we wrest control of the Democratic Party or shift them in a direction? It is absolutely an existential threat that they have. I don't know. Maybe it'll end up exploding and we have a new political party. But the fact is, it's the only one we have right now. And if it explodes, and we have to have another party, we're going to be in a much stronger position if we've won races and primaries and built some credible leadership that can win elections to a base in the meantime, right? Like if the Democratic Party explodes and we don't have any of that and we're not running those contests, we're in a worse place.
Well, that's the beauty of transitional periods, that even when many of the ideas fail, they're still contributing to shifting the balance of
Yeah,
power.
I really like how you said that about the, and what I've talked about, the hopeful part is that there's thousands of experiments going on, and you can even use like an evolutionary metaphor on this, that like in when something changes dramatically about the environment, suddenly there's tons of mutations that, you know, think of them as experiments, and then some of them that are well adapted to the new situation are the ones that take off. And so if we want to think about that as we have a new political situation and we have thousands of these experiments, these mutations, and happening all over the country, from Indivisible to different social movements to, and hopefully some of them, to Lancaster Stands Up, right? Hopefully some of them will take off and give us some direction. And I really agree with that. The contest, I do want to say, I don't know that this is true for sure, but I think it's pretty credible. I can't say which organization I was working for when we got this rumor, but the intel we got from the White House during the beginning of the Obama administration was that Joe Biden wanted bankers in handcuffs within 2 months of the administration. That he said, you've got to hold people accountable. We've got to prosecute the people who are guilty. And it will change the narrative of the whole administration. It'll frame the healthcare fight into one of like big industry versus everyday people. Like basically Biden wanted to do the 99% frame before it was cool. And he lost. He was marginalized by Rahm Emanuel within the White House, right? And so it's important to think about these contingencies, right? Like Tiananmen Square happened, right? There was a stalemate vote within the 8-person leadership council in China about whether to embrace the demands of the students or whether to do what happened, right? And those two things are really depressing because we had the worst outcome, right? But it's important to recognize when you lose, like when Bernie Sanders loses the nomination, like that it is all or nothing in terms of the outcome, but that doesn't mean that we were all wrong in the way that we did it. And coming close, you know, like we've got to think about, like, it's not fully a monolith. There are allies within even the worst institutions. There are allies, right? Like at the height of World War II, 1 in 7 SS officers was working for the underground, right? Like to take the extreme version, right? So we have to treat these things as terrains. But fundamentally, I think we have to build independent political power. What you said about the Tea Party's option to leave is the threat. And
Where would they have gone?
The threat was that they would start their own thing.
yeah.
And become a third party?
Yeah. It's the threat of a third party.
Pull the
Yeah.
rug out from under the Republicans.
Yeah. And I'll tell you in closing, our local Democratic Party is very, very mixed about us, about Lancaster Stands Up. In some ways, they love us because we're mobilizing people like have never been mobilized, and they recognize that they're going to need that kind of ground game if they want to win. And then when we held our door-to-door canvass, suddenly we start getting some emails and some like alarms of like, hey, this is our lane. We know how to do this. We got this. We're like, you don't got this. You've been losing for a long time, you know? And they were afraid we'd start a third party, right? They're afraid of a lot of different things. And then they would oscillate between that and like, well, what if we did this together? What if Lancaster Stands Up and the Democratic Party were the same thing? And we're like, 500 people don't come to a meeting called by the Democratic Party. They come to something called Lancaster Stands Up. You have a branding problem. We don't. So, thanks, but no thanks. And so it's actually exactly the position we want to be in, where they love us and they're afraid of us, right? And they don't know which way to feel, right? And a lot of their base is coming to our meetings and is excited, right? I did want to take another round of questions, but we're at time, so I thank you all, and I'm going to be out there with books and talking to folks, and thanks for the conversation.